Hi, welcome back. You're with Jason at True Vintage RC. And if you're here to watch this video today, then perhaps you've seen the two that preceded it, but this is number 3 of 3. So if you haven't yet seen the first two videos, I have them on my channel, and what we want to do is we're going to make some comparisons between the 1986 original Ultima and the 2019 re-release Ultima. So what I've got here is a brand new re-release kit, and I have a used 86 model Ultima which I have cleaned up and now I'm putting back together. So in the last video we finished with the transmission going together and the rear suspension components with the bulkhead, and I've been making comparisons of all the parts between the two cars, and some of them are noteworthy and some of them aren't. So the concept behind these series of videos was to see what parts could transfer even from the later model car to the earlier model cars, and for the reason is reliability or safety. Like we saw back there, they had some little covers that protect the lipo in case of impacts. It might cut into the chassis, which I thought was a really cool idea. Anyway, so moving forward, now we're now looking at the old steering servo saver, which is built into the bell cranks, versus the 2019 revised component. You can see just how bulky it is, and I really have to say it's just such a big upgrade for the re-release car over the original components, because the original steering servo saver would break very easily. It didn't take much to actually snap that plastic ring piece that went around and gave it some spring there. So yeah, looking at this steering component set straight away, I thought, well, this thing's actually super heavy duty, looks very reliable, and is probably going to give you very little trouble, if any at all. You can put some bearings into this steering setup, which is you can get some top hat bearings which can replace these little bushes here, and also on the off side of the which is the right side of the bell cranks, you can fit bearings in there as well. Sadly, you can't fit any on the servo saver side, but I don't think it's going to be a real problem. Yeah, you can see it's nice and free, and kudos to Kyosho. Right way through this build, I've just been so impressed with the improvements, even just the little things like these little conical washers that go underneath the balls of the ball studs there, just to allow the suspension to work a bit more freely and not bind up. They really did think of a bunch of little things to do which would improve the function of the re-release car. Anyway, so the reason why I wanted to make this video, apart from looking at the two cars, was to see which parts could be retrofitted back into I have an Ultima Pro XL, which was the last in the Ultima series of the chassis type, and what I will say is it does have a lot of old parts on it, and I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be great to see what re-release components could be made to retrofit onto that car. So the steering is one thing that I would like to go with. And here we are now moving on to the front bulkheads, and I really do want to point out some differences here. You can see the shock towers are obviously very different, and the difference with the front of this bulkhead is that it actually has a slightly wider track. So the inner hinge pins of the suspension arms have actually been spaced out, the best I could tell, somewhere between maybe 3 and 4 millimeters, so you'll get a slightly wider track. And what I really liked was these bosses right here, which actually receive the screw to hold the shock tower in place. They're, well, possibly twice as thick as what was on the original bulkhead, and instantly I thought to myself, well, this thing's going to be a lot more heavy duty. And so there I am pointing out the spacings between those two mounts for the pivot points of the inner hinge pin for the suspension arms. But yeah, and what I did was I wanted to check old and new. So This is the original shock tower going on to the re-release bulkhead, and I did find a very slight variation in the mounting holes. And so this is the new shock tower, which I got to say initially I didn't like, but I can see why they went this way. They put so much thought into it, and look at this little locking design. Once it's screwed in there, it looks like it's going to be held in place really nicely. So yeah, I've put it into fast forward now so we can try and get through some of this assembly stage. And again, you've got to like that they went to the trouble of at least putting adjustable camber links on the re-release, whereas on the original car, I always detested these things, but these solid upper links here, which in my opinion, I don't know why you put that on a competitive car, because you've got no adjustment there. But it is what it is, and the Ultima was a very successful car back when it came out, and Joel Johnson took not this standard car but a modified Kyosho Ultima to the win at the 1987 IFMA World Titles, and there have been many replications made of his car amongst the vintage community to celebrate and commemorate the win of that car, which had a graphite chassis. Pretty sure it had a stick pack cable tied down the middle of it. You know, so they had done some changes to it. He had a different chassis, he had different shock towers, different wheels, but who knows what they did to the gearbox. I don't know what happened to the internals, but I'm sure it would have been ball diff and hardened upper pinion gear and all that sort of stuff. And so anyway, yeah, back to the front end. They're both assembled now. And again, I'm just pointing out to how far the screw goes into the bulkhead, and sometimes you find these bulkheads end up running a bit loose on some cars. Front suspension arms, on the right you have the original, on the left there you have the reissue, and you can see some moulding changes, but generally they appear to be very much the same in regards to dimensions. So I don't think the geometry's changed at all, but you can see they've added some extra mouldings there to where those holes are in the arms. So look, I don't know the specifics on if it changed the characteristics of the arm in flex wise or anything like that, but you know, they did a pretty good job of looking at some of the advances they could make. And here in the front C hubs we have just where the hinge pin passes through the hub, they built up that little boss around there. So I wanted to highlight that, and that could be really helpful to be more reliable on your buggies, especially if you're hitting the track and you know you're making those big jumps. But it seemed to me that all the dimensions were exactly the same, aside from that section being bulked up. The steering arms were, well, they looked pretty much the same. They didn't put left and right on them though for some reason. I don't know why, but all the dimensions seemed very much the same. They didn't seem any different at all, but they've remained very faithful to the original there, and now it's all starting to go together. And yeah, these E-clips, my God, they are a pain, and I don't usually complain about putting E-clips on, but on the re-release they seem to be a little bit different, and I managed to cut out all the outtakes with the E-clips flying across the room, and I felt like a real novice. And let me tell you, I've built hundreds and hundreds of cars now, and I've dealt with them all, pretty much most of everything out there, and I've got to say that E-clips gave me some trouble, so expect a little bit of trouble. Again, I edited all that stuff out because it just made me look like a buffoon. Anyway, it's all going together now, and what you'll notice is all the worn parts are on the right hand side, of course, from the original Ultima, which hadn't seen a great deal of use. It was used, but it wasn't abused. There was no wasn't excessive wear on the underside of the car, so I thought this was a good attempt to actually clean up all the parts and put it back together, you know, as a layman might. So I didn't polish anything. Usually I would polish pivot pins and shafts and do, you know, maybe polish up the aluminium towers and the chassis, but I just didn't bother with this car. I just thought, well, let's just get it back together, and ultimately it would be good to drive the two cars side by side and just see, you know, what sort of differences might be felt in the driving experience. Anyway, back to the here I am being very careful about putting that E-clip in. And for anyone who may not be aware, E-clips tend to be press cut. So they've actually got a sharp side and they've actually got a bit of a rounded side. And for anyone putting these E-clips on, what I'm doing is I'm checking the orientation, and I tend to put the sharper side, or what would have been the bottom side of the sheet when it was cut, I tend to put that on the outside, which I'm sure other racers will tell you the same, because it lessens the chance of it actually being under duress pushed off the end of the shaft in that groove there. So I'll probably thank the guys at Opel for that one, because when I used to be on the forums there, you'd hear about some good concepts of how to do things properly, and yeah, that was a great forum to be on, and I learnt quite a lot from there. So yep, look, it's all happening, it's all going back together. That's the re-release front end, which is complete. And as I said, what I was doing with this build the whole time was I was actually going off the re-release manual and building the car as per what the instructions were saying. So I did that to both cars. I don't have an original Ultima manual, but I could have downloaded one, but I thought, look, it's pretty common sense. And here we are. Ultima's got the plastic bushings for the front wheels. I replaced those with ball bearings, of course, and they ran these terrible plastic nuts that, you know, I just don't have any time for. In fact, some of them were split. And this is the difference in the front bumpers, so there's quite a bit of difference here. There's actually, they can fit inside of each other, so it's the re-release is a little bit narrower, and the profile is smaller, and it's actually a little bit narrower there, and it's actually got this moulding cut out of the sides, so that's probably just to allow some room for the suspension arm to not bind up on the bumper. So yeah, that's one change. But what I will say is I actually took the re-release front end and I bolted it to the original car and vice versa, and everything lined up reasonably well. I'm not going to say perfectly machined together. There might have been some variation, but yeah, you could actually get the car together, which was really good to know. So yeah, there's me pointing out again. They've got the little conical washers that go underneath the ball, and then it screws down, here we go again, into, whoops, slipped off there, just screws into the steering arm. And yeah, like I really wanted to make a note of these little things, because I reckon they really do help out in stopping any binding, and nobody wants to go to the track and have things that don't work. I don't. So yeah, this car just went back exactly as it was pulled apart. Everything was cleaned, as people would see back in the very first video, and it's all going back together. Bumpers going on, and yeah, as you can see, the original car didn't have countersunk screws in the chassis, which, you know, well, they've obviously revised that issue on the re-release. And yeah, like again, going to go back to the 2019 model. All I can say is I was just really impressed, and I get it, there are more modern cars out there, but Kyosho took this car and they did lots of great things with it, including the shock absorbers. So for anyone who really wants to know, the red shock absorbers are identical to the gold shock absorbers that come on the Kyosho Ultima Mid re-release car, which is coming out later this year. It also came out on the Turbo Optima, and the only difference is the colour and the fact that the gold ones are threaded. That the seal housing is the same. Everything else is pretty much the same. I didn't notice any difference whatsoever. So I built a few of those gold sets of shocks now, and yeah, I built probably about 5 sets of these red shocks now, and I really do like these shocks. I think they're great. I don't know how they compare to the most modern of shock out there, but certainly a big improvement on what the old ones were. And as you can see back there, the 10mm shock body of the 1986 model car versus the 12mm body of the 2019 car, and yeah, I, this is a really interesting section, is because I really do enjoy actually building these 2019 shocks. They are just really nice. They go together well. They work well. They're just super smooth. And the original 1986 shocks were absolutely amongst the worst shock absorbers I've ever had to work with. And I've used to have the Kyosho Ultima back in the later part of the 1980s, and it had the same shock absorbers, and they have one seal. It's a black hard rubber seal. It's just terrible. The shock shaft doesn't have a it's non-adjustable valving. It's just got this round end that's welded or something, or part of the shaft. But I've just never liked it. They leak like a sieve. They've got very hard to get set up properly, as in the pressure right. So they do require a bit of work. So on the left hand side, I got shocks that really impressed me, and I got on the right hand side, I very begrudgingly was putting these ones together, and I hope I never have to do them again. And I bet you would too. I don't know anyone that would put in the kind of effort that I did, but for the purpose of the video, I really wanted to do the best I could to, I guess, represent the 86 model car as best as it could be, because I do want to drive it. I do want to get some video of it in action, along with the 2019 car, and it wouldn't be fair to leave the shocks with no oil, or at least have enough oil in the shocks to get a run out of the car. So here we are putting it together, and I'm really struggling. I think I'm over it even by the first shock absorber, but God, I had to grind through. And yep, here we are, just all the bits going together, and yeah, clearly this is all fast forwarded. I cannot move this quickly. But the only thing that I did polish on the Ultima was these shock shafts, because they were a bit grubby, and I just wanted to get the shock shafts to have the very best chance of sliding through the O-ring seal with least chance of leaking. So yep, now I'm and what I did, just, I don't even think that oil is going to be right for these shock absorbers, but I'm just going with a kit oil, and it seems to be a really lightweight, and I don't get it, because generally I tend to run my buggies with about 30 weight in the rear, 35 in the front, but you know, I don't know if this weight is correct. I think it says 7.5 weight, whatever that means, I don't know. But anyhow, you got to love how these new shocks go together too. They come with these really cool tools, so you don't have to mark the red shock bodies. Yeah, very impressed with it all. They all work really, really well. And here I go. This is where it starts. It took me an hour to fill the oil and balance them out, and just try and get some normal activation out of the shock absorber. You know, I've managed to edit it all out, and yep, here we are making the comparison. So in the first video, the shock caps were just all busted. So what I've done is I've gone with some other Kyosho upper spring retainers, and these work really well, and they did come on some of their other shocks, and I've never seen one of these go wrong. So it was just the original Kyosho Optima and Ultima spring retainers that cracked almost the minute you looked at them. So just making some comparisons there between the coils, the front coil. Actually, what I will say is the coils on the 1986 model car seemed really stiff for what they were. Yeah, I don't know whether they've got it oversprung or what, but yeah, I'm sure most people back in the day took those red shocks off the minute they got the car for the racetrack and went straight to Kyosho Golds, which is yeah, which was pretty common. The Kyosho Ultima seemed to be, like the RC10, one of the most modified cars back in the day that I saw at the racetrack, and it was nothing to see people swapping out those old shocks for the Kyosho Gold shocks, and I'm sure there are other brands out there. So yeah, back in must have been around about 1980. I would say 89 maybe. I can't remember exactly, but I did race the Kyosho Turbo Ultima, and that came with the Option House Platinum dampers. And back then I thought, wow, these are going to be like the best shocks ever made. And probably over dampened for a two-wheel drive, if I'd have to admit. But yeah, so that was my only experience racing an Ultima back in the 80s, was the Turbo Ultima. I ran it in 540 class and I ran it in stock, but I did see a lot of cars go around the track that were heavily modified and doing really well, I've got to say. So there were lots of things that could be done to Ultimas back then, and you very rarely find a completely standard Ultima. You know, I'm not saying that it's impossible to find them or anything, but generally they were heavily modified and a lot of things were changed. But I was fortunate to find an original here, so why not pay it some respect and get it going. And here we are, 2019 car, shocks going on, and God, everything is just so buttery smooth with that car. It's just, everything just works so good, and you've really got to give it to Kyosho over Tamiya with the re-release thing. They really do go back and re-engineer almost every single component that goes on their cars, and you've got to say, I wish I had have had an Ultima that worked like this back in the day, because it really, I just can't see any fault with them, you know, as with the design. Like, they've taken the design, in my opinion, maybe as far as you'd want to take it, outside of putting a graphite chassis on it. And but I was really skeptical of the re-release Ultima. I didn't think it was that appealing to me, so I don't know how I ended up with two kits, but one came from a trade and the other one I bought from a store, but I thought, look, let's give them a go. So yeah, so on the right again, on the top there of the screen we have the original Ultima, and on the bottom we have the re-release. And now we're going to make some comparisons between wheels and tyres. And I got some old tyres on this car, and they're a little bit worn, so someone's probably used them on the street. And I wanted to make, I'm not going to put those tyres back on it, so I got a pair of Marwan's reproduction OT66 rubber tyres. And a big thanks to Marwan. He has done amazing things for the Kyosho fans out there, because he's been reproducing tyres, bodies, decal sets. I'm not sure what else there is, but he's done some really great stuff that many of the collectors have just been absolutely dying for. So the original car had three-piece rims, so they had a locking rib on the inside of the tyre, which was a bit of a struggle, which I edited that out because that just, yeah, it was not pretty to look at. And yeah, the fronts have a two-piece and they need to be glued, so you can't get away with running those fronts without gluing them, that's for sure. So the rears you don't need to glue, but the fronts you do. And here we are with the much more glue. This is just one product that can be used, as many out there, but it was worked well for me. And making some comparisons here with the two cars side by side. And I got really lucky with the original 86 body set. I managed to throw in the simple green, some paint started to come away, and then I hit it with some oven cleaner and it all came off, and I was like, that just never happens. I never get that lucky. But anyway, I got it back to almost clear, and here I am overlaying it over the re-release body shell, and they look so close to the same size, I couldn't tell any difference. And I tend to do that with re-release bodies. I like to put them over or under the originals where I can and see how much they've shrunk. But Kyosho, they went back and they remodeled the driver. As you can see there, they've made it symmetrical, and the original they had to make room for the mechanical speed controller, which was operating just underneath the driver's arm there. So apart from that, they seem very, very close, and I'm sure a lot of collectors out there will be glad to have them. And now onto the roofs, and I could not tell much of a difference other than the rear pair of holes there had a slot in them, whereas a re-release had just two holes. They seem to be very close to the same moulding. I really couldn't tell, but they were very close. And now onto the roll bars. So the original had a wing mount that was molded into the rear of the roll bar, whereas the reissue didn't. That's part of the gearbox structure, and they did also have the pipes that run between the two bars. They mounted them differently for some reason, but aside from that, they look very, very similar. And I did check the roll cages between the two cars, and they did go back and forward between the two. So again, these things were very expensive on the collector market for quite some time, and I'm sure a lot of people who want to actually have a roll cage that don't have one for their Ultima can now get one cheap as chips. So yeah, that's good. And yeah, here we are. Phillips drive screws. Oh, I just hated every minute of it. It was so tempting to go to a stainless steel screw kit, but no, I just wanted to keep the car about as original as I could, including all the screws. The only real modifications I made to the car was to put ball bearings in it, and that was almost it. So, to anyone who's never owned an Ultima, what I wanted to do was show the viewers how the upper roll cage clicks into those receiving sections in the chassis, just so people could know that through the body that's what actually goes on. So you can't get rid of those mounts on the underside of it. And here I am with the 86 model, same thing again. I'm folding it over, and those two sections go down into those receiving pieces on the chassis, and that's how the weight is transferred down for rollover accidents. Yeah, and I think Kyosho really didn't need to do this system here, because everybody breaks at this point, and this is where hook pins go in or body pins go in. But geez, it is such a pain to get that body off once they're on those lugs there. And yeah, I very begrudgingly used them. So yeah, here I am mounting the rear wing. So yeah, this is fantastic. The rear wing mount on this car, you've got two options. You can have it up high, or they've got a lower version, which makes it look a lot more authentic to the original vintage. But what I did was I ended up not going with it. And I ended up not going with the white wing either, and you'll see when you get to the end of this video, which is just around the corner. There's the cars assembled, and that's the manual, the only manual I used to build the two cars. And now off to the final shots of the car. So there's the 86 model car, there's a re-release car which I painted in black and put a black wing on it, and I've fitted up both cars with vintage Le Mans motors. The 240S went into the 86, and the 480 Gold went into the 2019. And this is me just learning how to use a DSLR camera in my light box. And yeah, I just wanted to get some really decent photos so we could see what's going on. So yeah, the 86 model car doesn't have a brand new body. It's had a few dings and whatever, but it's painted and it's all back together. So anyway, thank you very much for watching, everyone. It's been a real pleasure putting this series together, and I hope it's offered some insight and some value to the viewers. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to take the cars to the track soon, so there'll be more videos with these cars in action. So please leave the video a like, and why not subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching.